Hello and welcome back to the Accelerated Webinar Series on Demand, where we talk about everything it takes for a faster go-to-market strategy for medical devices. This series is developed and brought to you by Aventec in collaboration with Dassault Systems. I am your host and moderator, Shashank Nanivadecker, and today we're welcoming back Stuart Wright, Simulia expert and business consultant, and Stephen Levine, Senior Director of Virtual Human Modeling from Dassault Systems. Continuing on from last episode, today we want to focus on how simulation and modern high-end simulation technologies can help a medical device company take steps to make sure that they're ideating the right product to begin with. Simulation has started to become part of the conversation in medical device V&V, and we will see how high-end simulation can now play a strategic part in medical device design, decision support, and regulatory approvals. To start off today, Stuart, since you had mentioned that the use of simulation so far is not being integrated all the way into post-market, even though companies are using it, what I'm
Mhm.
interested in finding out, and I'm sure the listeners would be as well, is with the use of simulation, what impact will that have on the traditional development model that companies have faced? So they would usually go through ideation, then defining the requirements, then preliminary product design, then detailed design, and
Mhm.
then some V&V throughout that process, and then some clinical trials, some animal trials, if that's what is necessary, and things like this. So that tended to be the traditional development process. So with the use of simulation, how do you see that process being impacted?
So I think it has huge potential. We talk about inflecting the curve, and what we mean by that is the cost of getting a new device to market is massive, and it can take, even for an incremental change, it can take 3 or 4 years. For a new product with some markedly new capability, it can be 10 years. Not least because of the duration and cost of the physical testing cycles that have to be endured by the development organization and by the people, the animals that are being tested upon. So what we need to understand, what I'd like the audience to understand, is that even when a brand new device, a new device gets to market, there is still some unknown in the performance of that device. It could still be um, put in a patient that it is not suitable for, with no ill will or no no fault of the practitioner or the development organization. But it's simply the fact that the device, when we rely on a physical testing paradigm, it cannot be validated 100% prior to going into market because all individual patients are different to one another. And it's always possible there's going to be a set of circumstances for which a device can fail, is not suitable. What simulation allows us to do is both eliminate some of that risk. I don't think we'll ever eliminate all of the risk. Um, it's it's possible, but I think there'll always be some little kernels of uncertainty. But we can go a long way to eliminating a lot of that risk that still exists when a device gets into market. But we can make a very significant change also to the cost of developing the device in the first place. And we talk about left shifting, and this is something that happened in the automotive and aerospace industries, other industries too. I mean, we keep citing those two industries because they're prominent in most people's minds and they're archetypal illustrations of how simulation is very effectively leveraged. Um, but what left shifting amounts to is validating a new product, much more extensively in early stages of development. So ideating the right product, then um, doing preliminary design of the right product, and doing good, solid preliminary design. So what we used to call preliminary design actually takes the product further in our understanding of how it's going to perform than we used to. And eliminating the propensity or the potential for escapes, late stage failures. The worst thing that can happen for a device program is to observe failures in clinical trial. Well, maybe that's the second worst. The worst is extensive failures actually in market. So perhaps the second worst is failure in a clinical trial. Hugely expensive. But simulation gives us the potential to totally change the dynamics of the accrual of cost and time in a development program. And we do that by front loading simulation into the development program. So we can evaluate the performance space of a new device, evaluate its functionality, the key performance indicators, much, much more extensively without ever relying on an animal or a cadaver or a human.
Uh, Yeah, that's a huge point, Stuart. And let me also add, connected to that, and this is a discussion that I've been having quite a bit with the FDA. You know, many of the recalls that ultimately happen in the field are actually manufacturing errors, where the process, because the complexity of these devices are not as well managed as they are in other industries, and that gets back to the idea of uh, making sure you're producing the product and having digital continuity between the product you test, you design, and manufacture. And again, I think that's a learning that we've seen in other fields. Is once you've done the digital design using simulation, you can then make sure that your final product is what you expect it to be. And that's something that the FDA, particularly with personalized products, because they really want to understand the degree to which your manufacturing process is producing the right product as opposed to measuring its pure performance. As I mentioned earlier, it's difficult to anticipate with personalized products. And so they are more and more looking at the quality of the manufacturing process and the integrity that as a criteria for regulatory approval.
I think that's a very important point to add as well, because as Stuart was mentioning, simulation and judging the device's performance, and front loading simulation to be able to do that. I think front using simulation as part of your manufacturing validation is also an interesting way of using it, because oftentimes like processes like forming, or if you're doing like like hot plastic injecting or thermoforming, something like that, these processes may cause some defects, especially plastic being used to some extent in medical devices. Also, small defects in manufacturing that occur as a result of the process. If you have defects coming into the product as a result of one-off situations, I think that's much more easy to identify, as opposed to if the defect is happening due to the process itself. So I think doing simulation there is it's a pretty interesting way of making sure that the device company is doing everything that it can to not only ideate and design the right product, but also to make it the right way. But with that said, I would like to segue into technology as it stands, because we have been talking about simulation and the potential that simulation has in medical device development, but through designing the right product, through manufacturing it the right way, and achieving proper patient compliance. What I would like to talk about is the technology that Dassault has been famous for bringing to market to be able to address these challenges. And we have been talking about the aerospace and defense and automotive verticals, where Dassault has been pretty, or Dassault Systems have been pretty prominent in bringing CAD software, bringing PLM software, and bringing tools for digital manufacturing. From a simulation standpoint, Dassault has also been very prominent through bringing tools like Abacus and Similia. But what I would like to hear is, with this advent of personalization and integrated product development from start to finish, how is Dassault changing the game as far as bringing technology to market that medical device companies can use? What is different that's being brought to the table?
So for many years, ever since its inception, um, I would say its invention, I don't know if that's the right word, simulation has been a craft. And what I mean by that, it has required, and it still, in very large degree, requires craftsmen to use it. So it's a very powerful tool in the right hands. It's a very dangerous tool in the wrong hands. And this is where, certainly, when I referred earlier in the life sciences industry, is a little circumspect about the reliability of simulation. This is in large part the reason why. However, the way capabilities develop in any organization is they follow a well-defined life cycle. So, first of all, it starts with a need. We need to be able to evaluate something because using simulation, because we can't physically test it, or it takes too long to physically test it, or we need a prototype and we don't have one yet. It's too early in the program. We don't have a prototype, or it needs to be tested in a human, and we're a long way from being able to do that. So we need simulation. So there's a need. If we haven't done it before, then a craftsman has to take hold of this tool and do his best job of devising a way to render this problem in a simulation model of some kind. Now, the next time he gets asked to do this, and of course the results that come from that model, they're going to be questionable. It doesn't mean they will be wrong. It doesn't mean they won't be accurate, but because it's not been done before, it will be questioned. And the trust that we can place in those results as evidence will be significant. However, the next time he comes to do it, and the next time, and the next time, and the next time, the capability gets better and better and better. It becomes more reliable. Um, it becomes more defensible, more predictable. Now, I tell you this because of the evolutionary lifestyle of simulation, and this is true for any capability. It could be looking at the stresses and strains in a stent. It could be predicting the life of a stent in operation. I tell you this because other industries have already gone through this evolution, and what they have done is they have already taken great strides in elevating their simulation capabilities from being a tool in the hands of a craftsman to being a capability that's broadly distributed. Now, that sounds like a trivial thing, and people will very often trivialize it by talking about democratization of simulation. Sounds easy. It's an easy word to say, but it's not an easy thing to achieve. You already mentioned our core capabilities, things like Abacus and other core solvers that are terrific at giving accurate results in the right hands. What we are really doing now across the Dassault System portfolio and leveraging the Dassault System's extensive portfolio of technologies is enabling democratization of simulation, but in a responsible manner that gives us both defensible, reliable quality of results, results that are sufficiently accurate for the context of their use, but also deliver those results in a highly economical manner. And I think those are two of the most fundamental aspects of the way we see the industry changing, and our strategy is aligned to that change. And indeed, we believe our strategy is empowering a large part of that change. The move in capability maturity from a craftsman's tool to a democratized capability for the community that gives us defensible results that can then be used with confidence in making meaningful decisions that push the design forwards at a more accelerated rate. And ultimately, they allow us to guide a clinical trial, direct a clinical trial, tell us which patients would be good in a clinical trial, which would not, tell us which patients we need in a clinical trial, and then even go so far as to mirror the clinical trial by creating digital twins of all of those participant patients so that we're predicting the performance of the device in the patient, we're anticipating the performance of the device in the patient, and we're also learning from the clinical trial to make sure our simulation is better executed the very next time we use it.
Yeah, I completely agree, Stuart. The process of moving from these first of a kind models that were, many cases the models were built to test or really validate our understanding. So models historically are a great way to capture what we understand, what we think we understand, and pressure test it. We can't test our understanding in our minds. We have to put it into the computer, and then we can test it and put it through its paces. And those craftsmen often come out of research organizations. We have massive funding from places like the NIH and DARPA that help us to build those craft tools. And companies like Dassault Systems, we've had a long-standing history of translating the innovation that comes out of those craftsmen using a proven platform of tools, taking the same innovation, but in a highly stable, robust, version controlled environment, a platform where people can use it reliably, particularly such that the regulatory bodies can interpret the data. They have no way of, as Stuart mentioned, if it's built by a craftsman, it may be beautiful, but too much effort for the regulatory bodies to understand the work that went into it. And that's a lot of value that we bring.
So when you say democratization of simulations, you're basically saying that a lot more stakeholders can now participate in bringing this data together to eventually then build models and therefore make it easy for regulatory bodies to approve them. Am I getting that correct?
Yeah, a great example is what we did with the Living Heart project. We took knowledge that had been scattered around amongst craftsmen all around the world who understand pieces of the heart. They were experts in their domain, but then uh, they retained it in their own world to use for their own purposes. So we accumulated that information into the entire model of the human heart, which we now make available to anyone. And so you don't need to be an expert in each of those individual domains now to model the human heart.
So to kind of echo what Stuart was saying about how simulation is a powerful tool in the hands of the right hands of the right craftsman, what Dassault is doing now is, because the platform is easier to use, because it's more democratized, it is allowing that craftsmanship to essentially become, as Stuart said, a capability which can be learned as opposed to, apprentice the way typical engineers and analysts or painters would in the past.
Right, right, exactly. And now let's remember that in any organization, the need for simulation can be very extensive. Or should I say, the potential application areas can be very extensive, very broad. It spans both the temporal aspect of different stages in the life cycle of a program, and it also spans the discipline dimension of electromagnetics, kinematics, design for manufacturing and an assembly, tolerances, structures, fluids, all kinds of disciplines. And in those two primary dimensions, you also have a lot of variability in the fidelity or the complexity of simulation that's required. And it spans the really rather simple, a quick stress analysis on a part, for example, to something highly complicated, like turbulence of blood through an artificial mitral valve within a beating heart. Now, The trick is to identify those capabilities that are core and really allow you to develop innovation into your products. Also, those capabilities that you use on a daily basis or only on a monthly basis. Those capabilities which you need to put in the hands of a large population versus those capabilities that are already they're okay residing in the hands of a small population, according to the volume of that kind of work that needs to be done. And what we do with our customers is we work across that spectrum, those at least three dimensions of the place in the program it's being deployed, the kind of simulation that is being required, which relates to the kind of decisions that have been made based on simulation, and the workforce into whose hands you're trying to deploy simulation, and identify the right strategy for the customer, and identify how to elevate the capability of the different simulation disciplines to the right level so that they can be most economically deployed to achieve the objective that the organization is giving of them, which is, as I keep saying, decision support, the right kind of decision support at the right time in the right place.
I think that term is very, it's a very catchy term, decision support. I think I can definitely see that in medical device companies using that pretty actively in their meetings, saying that they need decision support. And I think I would like to touch a little bit deeper on, as you said, that there are some core capabilities that companies would be considering to evolve their own modeling and simulation um, tactic or strategy or that portion of their business. And then there are some capabilities which could be used on a daily or a monthly basis. Can you elaborate as far as the core capabilities, like what potential core capabilities would a company potentially look at, especially with the kinds of devices that we're seeing today?
I think it's fair to say that we're talking about devices which are physical things, right? Rather than talking about software as a medical device. But that's a very important topic in its own right. But if we're talking about physical objects, heart valves, stents, the deployment equipment, orthopedic implants, drug delivery devices, be they wearable pumps or injectors or inhalers. And as we expand beyond devices that operate intimately with the human being, if we expand to equipment, for example, bedside equipment, all kinds of wearable devices, it's very easy to see how structural simulation and fluid simulation dominate. And that is what we see amongst our customers, that core capabilities very much center around being able to do stress analysis, strain, displacement, life simulation, nonlinear deformations, nonlinear responses, exotic materials, and highly nonlinear materials and polymers, but also the flow of fluids in pumps, the interaction with seals, the flow in tubes, and the interaction of structures with fluids, for example, in a heart valve. I think these are all core capabilities. Now, what we are seeing a very rapid expansion into with the advent of connected technologies is electromagnetics. So maybe your device does not have a motor in it, for which you might normally use some electromagnetic simulation, but maybe it does have a communication system, and therefore it has antennas, for example, pacemakers, or perhaps it has inductive recharging, or perhaps it has an uplink to a smartphone simply to record the dosage of insulin that a patient is using. These all require electromagnetics capabilities. So this is an emergent space which is growing rather quickly in life sciences. And I think those three, though we can, depending on the subsegment, we can always anticipate other areas, such as kinematics and simulation for manufacturing and manufacturing methodologies like additive. But I think those three are probably core. structures and fluids, and the emergence of electromagnetics.
So the other thing that I'm also seeing, and to kind of add on that, yes, materials are becoming more and more complex, and I can see a lot of companies and a lot of current simulation users in the automotive space and even in the aerospace area. They do material calibrations to build very complex material models. They use some pre-existing material models. If they use Abacus, for instance, it's known for its intense library of material models for it could be rubber, it could be viscoelastic, hyperelastic materials. And as companies do more and more material calibration, they're also starting to find an interest in doing automation. So things like doing Monte Carlo simulations to do parametric optimizations, or to do like structure or topology based optimizations. So would that count under a core capability that a company would look under, or would that be something different?
No, I think absolutely it does. And this is an evolutionary step change that's taking place in simulation. It used to be, so imagine when simulation is in the hands of a craftsman, his bandwidth is limited. He can only make one handmade chair per day, perhaps, to use a handcrafted furniture kind of analogy. But to really understand, perhaps to understand the phenomenology, to understand the influence of variability and variation, and that variation could be patient variation, it could be manufacturing variation, it could be material variation, or a whole host of other different drivers of variation between one set of circumstances and another. To be able to explore that and understand its influence, he needs to be making 100 chairs a day, 1,000 chairs a day. In other words, he needs to be doing hundreds or thousands of simulations, each subtly different from the next, but equally, perhaps equally, or statistically representative of a possible set of circumstances that the device can find itself in. And he needs to use that large population of simulations to be able to understand what represents the best solution, what represents the best shape, for example, the best material characteristics. Or does he necessarily need to limit the deployment of his device to a subset of a population because it is not suitable for use in anybody? So that is a very important transition that's taking place, moving away from the deterministic simulation of one simulation a day or one simulation a week, depending on the complexity, to whole clouds of simulation data points that represent the true statistical variability of the real world, from which you can really derive insights. And very early on, Shashank, you mentioned the word robustness. And really, this is what gets us to the very idea of personalization and or robustness.
Well, I agree. I think this transition from being able to understand the reliability in the real world is endemic to healthcare. It really is the complexity of humans, the fact that we're all a little bit different, that overwhelms the field with the belief that they can't understand what's going on, because it appears the same thing will behave differently in multiple people. There's a complexity that seems to defy your ability to use computational tools, when in fact it's truly the reason why you need computational tools. The fact that the human body, although it varies from person to person, it operates based on similar fundamentals. And the ability to capture the differences between the humans and build system models that allow us to capture that variability will create virtual clinical trials or in silico clinical trials that are far more robust than the real ones, with far less cost. And I think that's pretty exciting in principle if we can do that, because the nature of devices, particularly implantable or even wearable devices, these can be very invasive to people. And being able to test on large quantities of audiences, also underrepresented audiences such as children, the ability to include that, the variability that shows up in pediatrics is a huge opportunity for the industry and something that I know the regulatory agencies are enthusiastic about.
And I'm sure listeners can relate to that vision of moving towards in silico trials as well, and are curious about how best to incorporate it as part of their strategic advantage. Thank you once again, Stuart and Steve, for joining today. That will be it for today. For our listeners, simulation may already be part of your strategic advantage today, whether you're doing simple static and linear simulations or highly complex and highly realistic simulations with nonlinear materials, heat, fluids, electromagnetics, or other physical phenomena. The key question and consideration you should take away is this: are you doing enough to model the variations and extensive variety of patient conditions and circumstances to increase the reliability of your medical devices across your diverse patient populations? Dassault Systems and Aventec bring multidisciplinary engineering, design, simulation, and modeling together under one cohesive roof to speed up this process while also allowing you to capitalize on our capabilities to model the condition and model the variations towards a more reliable patient outcome. To learn more, you can find us at www.aventec.com/contact us or call us at 905 305 1711. In the next part, we will take a closer look at how evolving your core modeling and simulation capabilities using automation can lead to a niche domain of highly experienced analysts and making it available to designers and managers so that collectively the team can prioritize predictable medical device performance and patient outcome. Making the investment to raise your core competencies is a fundamental part of developing a winning go to market strategy, and we want to make sure that you know that you are not alone. The next part will be made available on demand next week. Until then, continue to let our knowledge empower innovation in your business. This is Shashank, your host for today. Thank you once again to our panelists, and thank you for listening. It has been a pleasure.